Hello and welcome back to IllumiNation, the Disney Lorcana podcast. My name's Max.
And I'm Sam.
And we are back at you with episode 59 of the podcast. And before we roll into the episode proper, I want to give a quick warning. You've heard these in the past from time to time. This is going to be a little bit of a rawer episode. Our poor doggo got a little sick, so you might hear the laundry happening in the background. She's doing okay. She's under the table where we're podcasting, so you might hear her as well clomping around. So just wanted to give everybody a heads up about that. Plus, this might not be as tightly edited because of all of the mitigating circumstances. But we have things to talk about. We have Lorcana to discuss, and we cannot be hampered. So let's move right into it. We are talking about testing, maximizing your testing, getting the most out of the time you spend practicing, learning, getting good, as it were. So let's jump into the episode proper. Step one for this particular process and maximizing your ability to test is know the deck you're testing. A lot of people build their own decks. A lot of people find deck lists online. Either way, any way you slice it, your steps don't really change. It's understanding what cards are the best versus what particular matchups. It's understanding what is the ideal opening line, whether you're on the play, on the draw, or what things do you change and what things do you adapt and flex to based on specific matchups. So, Sam, one of the more recent happenings about our Disney Lorcana testing was early on preparing for the Ink Inc. Open, which was a challenge qualifier. So we were doing a lot of testing. Mm-hmm. So you ended up kind of gesticulating early on in our testing. You were playing a few different decks, and then you finally landed on Amethyst and Steel as your weapon of choice. So we'll use that kind of as a parallel through this process because I think it's a good one to help us understand a little bit and apply these kind of nebulous concepts and ideas and themes to something a little bit more specific to help illustrate those points. So when we're talking about knowing the deck, learning what cards were important, what I think really drew us to Purple Steel was how different the context of the deck changed from the Whispers in the Well meta to the early Winter Spell meta, and I think it has since changed again for what it's worth. But we were looking at the idea of the deck morphing more from like a mid-range value engine into a more explosive deck that kind of took over the early game and then used these catch-up cards like Yzma to really push yourself through the mid and late game to eke out a win. So when we were testing it, the first thing that really drew our attention was the swap from Calhoun to Pocahontas.
Yeah.
And we were looking at the list coming out of the Leicester CCQ and trying to figure out what they were doing with the list, which was kind of an early framework for these Pocahontas-style Amethyst Steel builds. And I think that what changed and what we kind of knew about the deck in going into testing was this version of Amethyst Steel is going to be a lot more proactive than the previous versions, which were something more akin to like play Palace Guard, play a Calhoun, and kind of have Calhoun give them the little, oh, come over here and get you some if you're going to mess with this Palace Guard kind of attitude, into something more akin to playing Christopher Robin into playing Pocahontas to try to maximize very fast and very explosive lure gain out of the gate. So seeing that vast change, obviously we went into testing knowing a couple of things about that style of deck. Obviously we knew that this build was going to be a little bit better into something like Blurple. Mm-hmm. because the weakness previous was you were a little bit slower out of the gate, and that's something that the Blurple decks tended to prey on quite a bit. So making these swaps was really, really a big defining factor in you, I think, picking this deck.
Yeah, definitely.
Because before, your purple-steel matchup was good into dogs, but it was abysmal into Blurple. This was like, okay, you can still be a relative favorite into dogs, but you're not giving up as many percentage points into Blurple.
Right.
So that was kind of where our initial testing started. So you knew the deck. You knew what the opening lines looked like. You knew what cards you were playing for, and you knew the situation on the whole to leverage being on the play or on the draw to the best of your ability. So then we moved into the next most important piece, which is practice. And you usually want to practice against some of the more well-known decks. And the reason I say that is not because I'm a big believer in only meta decks should be tested or anything like that, or, coming up with rogue decks is a bad idea. Not specifically that, just because that's the lion's share of what you're going to see when you go out to play with people. Obviously, if you're local, it's a little bit different and it's a little bit more casual. That could change. But most of the time, whether you're playing digitally or you're playing in paper or whatever through webcam, that you're going to see a lot of these meta decks because people are testing them out, learning what they're about, and there's a lot of people think tanking these builds. So what you're thinking about when you're testing is what matters on both sides of the table, right? What cards are very key? What cards are very important in the meta right now? So that really ends up being able to inform when you're keeping, and when we go back to the first point of what hands do you want to keep on the play, on the draw, and into certain decks, this is going to help you make decisions about keeping your hand and your early inking choices. You're obviously not going to ink a card that is absolutely intended for the matchup you're up against. That would just be silly. But you need to learn what that card is before you can do that. So when it comes to that, the next part of this, which is far easier said than done, is trying your best to evaluate what's actually losing you games. Is it, a lot of us tend to hinge our focus on the end of the game. Well, this is what happened in the last couple of turns. I drew a dud, and I lost. But you got to look a little bit more carefully at the early and mid parts of the game. Who was ahead? Who was behind? Who was trying to catch up? Who was ahead on board? Was there a silly mistake that somebody made questing or challenging to fall behind and cause those cards you were looking for that you didn't draw to matter a little bit more? It's important to think about those things and not just go, well, my opponent got lucky and drew an important card, or I got unlucky and didn't draw an important card. That is easy to say, and to a large extent will be true a good portion of the time. However, there will also be little tiny micro decisions that are going to add up on one side or the other that will matter greatly when it comes to testing. So that's really what you want to start evaluating, is getting to be a little bit better at thinking about where a mistake was made, or what happened to catch somebody up, what happened to cause someone to lag behind outside of the last couple of turns. What put you from the early game into the mid game? We've talked about this in the podcast before, is that transition point. Like, it's very harkens back to chess, and chess has openings, and then you transition into the mid game of chess, and there are different strategies about different parts of the game you're in, dependent on what is happening in terms of movement, advantage, and pieces on the board. It's not much different in Lorcana, where you're very much trying to alter to find a strong opening line. Basically, every very popular meta deck, you can come up with 7 cards that are just, these are 90% of the time going to be the 7 cards that you want in your hand at all times, or 6, and the 7th varies depending on the matchup. Mm-hmm. So when you are playing with your Amethyst Steel deck, what were some of the cards that you were looking to have just kind of baseline all the time in your opening hand?
Depending if I was on the play or on the draw, Christopher Robin. If I was going for a Christopher Robin opening, I definitely wanted the Pocahontas. A 3-drop, and then strength, I would say, is what I'm looking for pretty much the whole time. If I'm on the play, then just, the curve into a strength.
Right. 1, 2, 3, 4 strength. Which is common. That's what you want, right? You establish the singer on 3. On 4, you play 1 or 2 characters, depending on what the size of the thing you need to deal with is. And then you do it. It's been, since Fabled, kind of the defining play pattern of Core Constructed. So I think that is totally understandable, and it makes a lot of sense. So then from there, you're trying to figure out, when it comes to deck flow and games being won or lost, are there cards that just end up not mattering a ton, or that they're so fringe playable that in some cases they're doing a lot, and in most cases, it's just not doing anything but being inked, perhaps? You have to think about that, and then you have to think about what are the odds that this particular card, if it's very polarizing, how much am I willing to hinge that being in the deck on that deck showing up at a given tournament?
Yeah.
So if you had a card in your deck that was very good into one specific deck, i.e. something like Angel. We know Angel, Experiment 624, is really good into dogs.
Yes.
But kind of is totally irrelevant into something like Blurple.
Right.
So when a card is that polarizing, you have to ask yourself, how often am I going to see the matches it matters in? In the Angels case, probably quite a bit, right? Because it was also good into the mirror. It was good into dogs. It was good into the aggressively slanted decks where the Sapphire builds, okay, not so good into the Sapphire builds. But outside of Blurple, the Sapphire builds weren't terribly popular early in the metagame. Sapphire Steel kind of fringy. You didn't see too much else, truthfully. Blurple easily representing a strong amount of the Sapphire color combination just kind of on its own.
Yeah. I think another example of, whether to include a certain card in your deck was the item removal, which I think we've talked about on here before. A lot of decks were playing Benja, and I decided not to play Benja because I just felt like it was really for one match, and I think the deck was stronger without it overall.
Yes, and and kind of using that as a way to dovetail back into this, what is your role in the matchup? And I think we identified that versus the dogs decks, the key was not necessarily having to deal with a card like Chromicon, because that card was just a very taxing card for Amethyst Steel regardless. So it was, okay, let's not worry about dealing with the Chromicon in terms of dealing with the card, that singular individual game object. Let's deal with Chromicon and the idea of what Dogs is doing, and let's just do what Dogs does to them. So you just decided instead to do what we call, when you've been playing trading card games, often you'll get in a situation where the matchup is more about racing to the win, and so you call it racing. So you're both trying to get, whoever gets to 20 the fastest wins. There's very little interaction. There's very little, you're making the most out of the game pieces that you have. You're both usually on limited resources. You're playing really hard to the board and keeping very few cards in hand. And you're just trying to simply get to the number 20 first. Or in other card games, whittle their life totals down to 0 first.
Yeah, and with this particular build, we built it in such a way that you're just gaining lore, and then you're racing them before they even realize you're racing them.
Right. So, yeah, big shout out. This kind of is the dovetail where we came from. We were testing the list that did well at the CCQ, and then our teammate was testing a list that was a little bit more aggressively slanted, and it ended up the right mix for the Ink ended up being something from our team's perspective that was a touch more aggressively slanted, but still resilient into the other steel decks. So you get to see cards like Lilo all bundled up, and Nani, that is steel, and I cannot remember what her little name is, but she's sitting at a window. But she's a 1/4. So it's hard for a singular strength, especially if you're on the play, for me to play a strength to catch up versus a 1/4. It just lets you quest a couple of times before I can answer it. So adding that ability to start to race them is really an interesting way to, yes, deal with the dog deck, but not just do what a lot of people were doing and go, well, I have to just answer Chromicon. And our position was, can't we just answer dogs? And I think that our teammate who was testing, shout out to Noah, came over and we were doing a lot of testing. I suggested trying the genie that boosts, the magical researcher, I think. And then we adopted that into the build and kind of shifted and wove in a lot of these pieces to where we ended up with a curve of lower costed cards that came out of the gate in a very effective and fast manner. Like you're talking about, if you were on the draw, Christopher Robin as a 2-quester for 1, and then you could follow up with something like a Lilo all bundled up who quests for 2 and costs 2, and then you could follow up from there with either playing a Cobra to gain immediate lure. You could play into the Genie Magical Researcher and then boost the following turn and quest again for 2. You could play Pocahontas in the mix there as well instead of Lilo. So you just have all these options for extremely robust and very explosive amounts of lure gain that ended up, if the dog's deck turns sideways, you're just very easily able to pivot. Go, I will strength that one thing and I'm going to just smash into those other things. And now the next turn, I'm going to go back to questing again.
Yeah, and the other thing we noticed while testing the deck was it was beating, I think, what we would think to be another one of the top 3 decks, which is Purple Steel. It was routinely beating the normal or, more streamlined Purple Steel decks.
Definitely. It was giving the amount of low end and the demand for them to have a perfect hand. Like, you have to curve out, you have to have that strength, and you have to have stats that matter, which usually involve not playing Genie. And at the time, that was really starting to, there were minor stirrings of it. And we were, I'd say, amongst the first to really put out lists that did not have a 4 in front of Genie Wish Fulfilled.
When on the stream, when they were talking about my deck on day 2, I believe it was Color is Law, mentioned that I was only on 2 of the Genie Wish Fulfilled. And she was talking about how much that 60th card matters. And I thought that was pretty cool.
Yeah, I think well identified and a great call out to exactly our line of thinking at this point was Genie forever a card that keeps you at parity because it replaces itself and provides a really strong clock. But if you're playing a deck that's just going faster than that, that particular card is sometimes effective to close out a game, but a lot of times can be irrelevant. And when you pair it with Doc, it becomes sometimes a major liability because now your hand has these uninkables that kind of don't ever give you a chance to deploy Doc smoothly.
When I really figured out that it was time to cut down on the genies was when I was always ditching genies to the angel triggers, to the snowball triggers.
Yeah, using the good aim effect on Angel to just take out your opponent's cards and go, the best thing that Genie is in this deck is fire the cannons, which is crazy. So it was, I think, a smart move to really whittle down on that top end. Then soon after, I know you and Noah were whittling down on Damona's and then whittling down on Elsa's and just going, we only need probably one of these cards to let us eke out a win. So we don't want to overload ourselves on too many of these cards.
Yeah.
So not quite going down to the level of a burn deck. We're not dropping everything to play Nalas and locations or gathering knowledge and wisdom, but we are trying to make sure we stay flexible and we present 2 different ways to handle things. So when you're testing, it's important to look at those things. What we found ourselves doing was looking at and talking about specific card choices that would give you a hard time. I was really testing a lot of Snowfort decks at that time and just giving you guys the biggest headache because it was some of the only Amethyst decks that were playing fast, well-statted characters and using the Snowfort to bolster them up. So we were starting to learn how good that Lilo all bundled up looked and things like that, where it's just this is such an annoyance for people to have to take out that a lot of times they don't even have the resources necessary to do it. So we started to learn what to do, and we started to trim and talk about what are the important cards that warrant an uninkable spot in this deck. How do we keep that number to something reasonable to where the deck doesn't just fail to function at any given point or any given moment? So learning about those patterns and that style and not just leaning on one particular card, something a la a Benja, to be able to get through that was a really, really important choice that helped you go undefeated through the Swiss rounds day one. So once you know all of these things, you come up with your plan, you come up with the cards, you come up with a pattern that gives you the best chance to win. So very much in line with the, are we racing this game? Or are we grinding this game? And are we playing, and the hand obviously impacts that, right? Like this play pattern could get you to where it's like, hey, I have to really lean on, I didn't get my super explosive opening, so I'm really going to lean on Yzma and Angel this game to help me just create this consistent engine that helps me remove everything on my opponent's side. Sometimes that's relevant. Sometimes you're like, well, I can't really do that to Blurple because everything they have has gigantic willpower, so I can't overcome that as simply. So you have to learn, what are you doing in that case? Like, what happens in that disaster moment when I didn't draw the good low curve hand and I'm playing against something like a Blurple? You have to just kind of suck it up a little bit, and you have to learn, well, I have to do what I have to do, and I have to use these resources to try to fight through it. And that's where something like a couple copies of Genie Wish Fulfilled can help pay off, because in the late game, you can present a wider board, but still maintain a decent amount of closing power to get yourself over the hump. So you need to learn those things. Like, it wasn't immediately intuitive to not want to just jam single card answers into a deck, but instead think about fundamentally, how do I play the deck just a little bit differently against certain opponents? And I've seen a lot of really good Sapphire and Emerald players do this, where they kind of adopt this, like, play some little characters and like a Donald Duck and just start questing and like forcing their hesitant opponent to start to attack on a different axis. Because you look down and you go, oh my God, they're like questing up to like 12 now. I like can't just sit here and ignore their 5 anemic little things anymore. Like, I actually have to try to present something onto the board to keep up. So I think being able to understand in certain situations and with certain hands that you're given, what are you doing? How do you make that work? How do you take something and create like a non-standard line for that particular occurrence? Did you have any matches during that run that was like I really got to cobble together something with a really bizarre assemblage of cards? Like, I got to really grind something out that's a little bit non-standard, like some outside of the box thinking, because you had tested so much, you knew that there was a chance to do something like that.
I definitely took some lines that weren't typical lines. Like, I even ditched a dock to an Angel trigger at one point with no card draw, because I just somehow knew the deck was gonna, cooperate. I can't remember like specifics. I played against Sky in round 5, who was on red Ruby Steel.
Ruby Steel.
And I did not know what to do. So game 1, he destroyed me. And then I just kind of, quickly learned what he was doing and was able to get there in the next 2.
Yeah, we talked about that going into it. And we were talking about the PodCon episode. And I was like, I think that this deck is trying to really utilize Light the Fuse to take over stuff. So I was like, I think maybe going fast might be the right tactic. And you found out quickly after game 1, you're like, I can't go fast. That's not the route I need to take.
No.
So you knew, because you tested not against necessarily Ruby Steel, but you tested against this style of play. You figured out what he was doing, what his deck was trying to accomplish, and how he was winning a game, and go, okay, I think I can come up with cards that counter that strategy because we practiced. You learned what the key cards were. So I can lean on these other cards that will help me grind harder than what he can, ironically, on a Ruby Steel build.
Yeah, it was definitely Angel was important, and, getting rid of his stuff as much as I could, because he had less card draw.
Right. Exactly. The downfall of Ruby Steel. So these are kind of the important things to take away from testing, and I'll walk it back and look at it from a macro view, because I know we were bouncing back and forth and applying these things to Sam's time and all of our time. I mean, we were testing a lot for the CCQ. So know the deck you're testing. Learn the deck you're testing. What do you want for an opening hand ideally? Does that change on the play on the draw? Does that change based on what you're up against? Then you need to practice the play patterns. If it's just pieces of games you're playing, like let's just play the first couple of turns and see where we go. Let's just can you run back and set up that board again so I can try a different line? Can you do something different? Go back and watch your games if you have the ability to do so. And think about what would happen if you deviate. Don't just look at the last couple of turns of the game. You need to figure out, this was a really bad sequence for me. This decision point that I made put me into a position where I had to then, they did this and it made me play from behind. Those are the things you're trying to identify. It's not about winning or losing. It's not about doing better or worse than the previous game or the previous night. It's about adding just a little bit of knowledge. If you take, in the beginning, you're going to spend hours of testing and you're going to get hours of knowledge out of it. By the time you've tested for the 150th, 200th hour, you're going to get very little because you already have learned so much, but every little piece you get will justify that extra time you've spent testing. So really don't focus on the don't focus on the result, focus on what got you into it, obviously. Identify those key cards, identify those key play patterns. Try non-standard things. Don't feel foolish trying something that looks ridiculous because you never know. It's like, actually that card seemed like silly to play there because it only quests for one, but that extra point of toughness actually really created a huge issue because it seems like this deck has no cards that deal with that number easily. That's a big issue. We've seen cards like Nakoma see play in Winterspell because it's a 4/6. Can't kill it with a World's Greatest Criminal Mind. Can't kill it with a he hurled his Thunderbolt. You can't. It's just a pain in the butt card to deal with. So it's been seeing a lot of play because people are learning things like that. That stat line really is important in this meta right now. Once you know what you're doing, you need to come up with plans and practice and make sure you try those things. Find out the play patterns. Is your deck trying to counter another deck's play pattern, or is it just adding something into the mix that helps get the play pattern or accomplish the goal that you're trying to set out to do in that case? Once you know all of those things, it's going to determine what role you're playing in the game. Are you the aggressor? Are you the one who's trying to slow down the aggressor? What is everybody up to, and how does it differ based on the matchups that you're trying to play? Are you trying to slow the dog's deck down, or are you just trying to race them? Those things are really important, and I think without that tons and tons of testing time, even though early on you were bouncing around. You had played Blurple a lot, and you're like, I guess I'm going to play this deck.
Amber Sapphire.
There was a lot of different choices out of the gate that we were looking at and testing and putting in hours and hours of practice to figure out. But at the end of the day, if you do the testing, if you put in the 10,000 hours, you sit down for a few hours every night and try to set some time aside to win, I do think you're going to see results. I think that you're going to know what to do, and having that ability to stay calm and cool and focused and know your game plan at the table can account for a lot of your ability to stay the course, not make silly decisions that are going to go, oh, why did I do that? I didn't realize how bad it would be if they did that. They totally got me. You want to mitigate those gotcha moments that surprise out of nowhere. But this is often why you see people try these different off-meta rogue decks, because they want to get people with the gotcha factors. Talking about Sky's Ruby Steel deck. Sam hadn't listened to that episode of Podcana, and she didn't know what he was up to. So she's like, wait, what's he on? What is this deck? So I tried to give her the 45-second summary of what he was doing as she showed me her pairing for the round.
Which he told me it was different than what he had put on the episode anyway. But.
So it was a pretty interesting thing to hear, and it was cool that you got to scrape one out against him. So you've won 100% of the games you've played against him, which I don't think a lot of people can say, having faced him, which is really awesome. Anything you want to add about testing and thoughts and ideas?
I just think, we're in set champ season, and I did, whatever, it was 50, 60 hours of testing for that CCQ, and now going into set champ season, my deck is not what it was. So I think making sure you're continually testing, because the meta changes, and, like you mentioned, Nakoma's was seen. That wasn't really seen back when we were testing before. So different cards, different decks come about. So I think it's important to keep testing the whole time. Yeah,
Sam, speaking of the set champs, you definitely just won your first outing at set champs.
Yes.
And you were not playing Amethyst Steel. You were not playing Amethyst, you traitor. What were you playing?
I was playing Amber Steel, which is definitely the first time I've ever registered that deck.
Yeah, Amber Steel mid-range. So like Amber Steel, what this core constructed season would call a song style deck.
Yeah.
And you've been playing that for the past probably few weeks now.
Yep. I got beat by it once on Purple Steel, and then I went right to it.
Yes. Yeah. Yep. Shout out to other teammate Henry. He ended up playing him at locals, and he gave you a beating.
I scooped on turn 2.
Yeah. It can. Yeah. The Amber Steel deck definitely has the ability to run away with things. Really interesting list. Really cool way to attack the meta. It actually has like decent game into all of the decks. So you see that now has become a pillar of the format in its own way. So things do definitely change. And you want to change and roll with it. I don't think we've come close to testing. We were testing like it was a full-time job going into the CCQ.
Yes.
Because we wanted to give ourselves the best chance to win. Now we'll test a couple hours a week maybe. Like we'll jam a few games here or there. Or we'll go to our locals and we'll test if one of us has a notion or an idea or something. Like, oh, I saw this cool deck. Do you want to try it real quick? And we'll do bounce games. But I'd say now we're much down much closer, like maybe like 2 to 4 hours a week in testing.
Definitely not what we do for the, bigger tournaments.
Right. So it's all about your expectation, what input you put in, the output will help you kind of justify what you've done in terms of the amount of time and attention and effort you've put into it. You should be seeing those results coming out in better performances overall. Hopefully, not every tournament is everyone's day, and you can lose in spite of all of your testing, certainly. But the core concept here, and the thing to leave the episode, I think, with, is to take your time and think not about the results, but the process and the steps that got you there. And if you do that consistently, and you really think about what you're doing and carefully plot and plan, you will be able to
keep questing.